The wind howled a lonely song through the Bitterroot Mountains, a song older than man, wilder than any beast. It carried the scent of pine and approaching snow, a warning whispered across the frosted peaks. Up here, life was carved from granite and grit, a harsh truth for any soul daring enough to call these remote valleys home. But sometimes, even the most isolated wilderness could not keep two paths from colliding. And sometimes, a single groan, a shared laugh, could change everything. Prepare for a tale of unexpected shelter, of hearts slowly thawing against the chill of winter.
If you've ever felt lost and found, or dreamed of a fresh start against impossible odds, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to Rescued by the Ridge, hit that notification bell, and join our journey into the untamed heart of the Old West. Every week, we bring you stories of love, survival, and the enduring human spirit. Let's ride together into this epic tale.
The Bitterroot Mountains stood like giants, their snow-capped peaks scraping the bruised canvas of the late autumn sky. Silas Thorne knew these mountains like the back of his calloused hand. He felt the shift in the air, the heavy silence that fell before a truly monstrous storm. The old-timers called it the 100-year storm, a winter so fierce it could swallow entire wagon trains. Silas had been preparing for weeks, stocking his small, sturdy cabin high on a secluded ridge. He chopped the last load of firewood, stacking it meticulously against the cabin wall. Miles away and hours behind schedule, Ilara Vance shivered, her teeth chattering despite the thick wool shawl wrapped tightly around her. She had strayed from her small wagon party, searching for a spring rumored to run clear even in the leanest times. The other wagons, slow and creaking, were already well ahead. She had promised to catch up, but the world around her had turned into a swirling white blur. A sudden, violent gust of wind whipped loose snow into a blinding curtain. One moment she saw sparse pines, the next only white. Panic tightened in her chest, a cold knot worse than the mountain air. She spun, trying to find her tracks, but they were already gone. Her breath plumed in icy clouds. She stumbled over a hidden root, falling into a drift, the snow soaking through her skirts. Her vision blurred, not just from the snow, but from a creeping numbness. She pushed herself up, her legs heavy, her mind foggy. She just needed to find shelter, any shelter. Silas, meanwhile, was checking his last perimeter trap line, not for game, but for signs of larger predators. A flash of unnatural color caught his eye amidst the muted greens and grays of the winter forest, a swatch of bright blue fabric stark against the canvas of white. No animal in these mountains wore such a color. He frowned, his instinct screaming danger. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a seasoned hunter, tracking the faint, stumbling prints in the freshly fallen snow. They were human, and they were headed straight for the treacherous drop-off near the old cedar grove. He found her slumped against a snow-covered rock, half buried, a thin blue shawl barely covering her. Her skin was pale, her lips blue. He cursed under his breath, a lone woman lost and freezing, just as the biggest storm of the decade was about to hit. He had two choices, leave her or burden himself with a stranger. The mountain man in him warred with the memory of his own lost pasts. With a resigned sigh, Silas bent down. He scooped her slight form into his arms. She was light, terribly light, and barely conscious. Her eyes fluttered open, wide and unfocused, then closed again. Silas began the long, difficult trek back to his cabin, the first heavy flakes of the real storm beginning to fall around them. The journey back to the cabin was a battle of inches. Silas moved through the deepening drifts with the steady, rhythmic gait of a man born to the high country. Inside his arms, the woman was a fragile bundle of cold wool and fading breath. He kicked the heavy oak door shut behind them, sealing out the roaring wind. The cabin was dim, smelling of wood smoke and dried herbs, but the residual heat from the hearth felt like a physical weight against his frozen skin. Silas didn't waste a second. He laid her on a thick buffalo robe near the hearth. He knew the dangers of sudden warmth. To immerse a frozen person in hot water could shock the heart. Instead, he reached for a basin of cool water and a clean rag. This was an old mountain remedy, gradually bringing the temperature up, rubbing the skin just enough to wake the blood without breaking the delicate frosted tissue. As he worked, he studied her. She wasn't from these parts. Her clothes were fine but ruined. Her hands, though small, had the beginnings of blisters that hadn't come from mountain labor. She was a runaway, he reckoned, or a seeker. Either way, she was trouble he hadn't asked for. He moved to the cast-iron stove, adding a few splits of seasoned larch. The wood caught quickly, the sap popping like distant gunfire. Silas began to prepare a simple broth, not for himself, but for her. He used dried venison and a handful of wild onions he'd harvested and dried in the late summer. It was a survivalist's meal, rich in the salts and minerals a body needs to recover from the brink of exhaustion. A soft moan broke the silence. Ilara's eyes flickered open, darting around the unfamiliar timbered ceiling. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt like lead. "Stay still," Silas barked, though his voice lacked any real bite. "Your blood hasn't quite decided to keep flowing yet." She blinked at him, her gaze settling on his rugged, bearded face. Where am I? The wagons. They'll be looking for me." Silas turned back to his broth, his silhouette tall and imposing against the firelight. "Unless those wagons have wings, they aren't looking for anyone tonight. The pass is closed, ma'am. 6 feet of snow says you aren't going anywhere until the mountain decides to let you." Ilara looked toward the window, where the glass was already frosted over with intricate, icy patterns. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was trapped in the middle of nowhere with a man who looked as wild as the storm itself.
The first 3 days were the hardest. Outside, the world had vanished into a swirling void of white, but inside, the silence was just as heavy. Silas Thorne lived by a strict rhythm, a clock set by the rising sun and the fading embers of the hearth. He moved around his small domain with a quiet efficiency that made Ilara feel like an intruder in a well-oiled machine. By the 4th morning, Ilara's strength had returned, and with it, a restless energy. She couldn't sit idly by while Silas worked from dawn until dusk. She watched him haul in heavy logs and check the chinking between the logs, the mixture of mud, moss, and animal hair used to seal out the biting wind. "I can't just sit here," she announced, her voice cracking the stillness. "I want to help. I need to earn my keep." Silas didn't look up from his task of sharpening a skinning knife. "This isn't a boarding house, Miss Vance. This is survival. Out here, a mistake doesn't just mean a ruined dinner. It means a cold hearth or an empty belly." Determined to prove him wrong, Ilara took charge of the evening meal. She found a sack of flour and a jar of lard, intending to make the biscuits her mother had taught her back east. But the mountain had different rules. At this high altitude, the air was thinner and the chemistry of baking was a fickle beast. She didn't realize that water boiled at a lower temperature up here, or the dough rose differently in the dry, thin air. An hour later, the cabin was filled with a thick, acrid smoke. The biscuits were charred black on the bottom and doughy in the center. Silas walked in, his nose wrinkling. He looked at the ruined food, then at Ilara, whose face was streaked with soot and tears of frustration. "I was just trying to help," she whispered, bracing for a lecture. Silas looked at the stove, then back at her. He saw the raw determination in her eyes, a spark that reminded him of the pioneers who first crossed these ridges. His gruffness softened just a fraction. He pulled a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven from the shelf. "The mountain is a hard teacher, Ilara," he said, using her name for the first time. "You can't force it to do what you want. You have to listen to it." He sat her down and showed her how to regulate the heat by moving the coals rather than just piling on wood. It was her first real lesson in the silent language of the West. As they shared a simple meal of dried fruit and salted pork, the tension in the room shifted. They weren't just a woodsman and a lost girl anymore. They were two souls bound by the same fire, waiting for the world to thaw.
The wind outside had reached a fever pitch, screaming through the eaves like a freight train. Inside, the cabin creaked under the weight of the fresh snowfall piling onto the roof. Every few minutes, a heavy thud echoed through the room as a layer of ice slid off the cedar shingles. Silas sat by the hearth, his shadow dancing long and lean against the timber walls. He noticed Ilara shifting uncomfortably on the main bunk, a sturdy-looking piece of furniture he'd built years ago from green oak. A sudden, sharp crack rang out, loud as a pistol shot. Ilara jumped, and the corner of the bed dipped precariously. "The cold," Silas muttered, standing up. "It shrinks the wood and pulls the joints. That support slat just gave way." He couldn't have her sleeping on the floor. The draft that swept across the planks was cold enough to freeze a bucket of water by morning. Silas grabbed his heavy mallet and a few spare pegs. He knelt in the narrow space between the bed and the wall, then slid his upper body beneath the heavy frame to inspect the damage. "I need you to help me, Ilara," he called out, his voice muffled by the mattress. "Lean over and grab the corner of the frame. When I give the word, lift it just an inch so I can realign the tenon into the mortise." Ilara moved quickly, kneeling on the edge of the mattress. She reached down, her fingers gripping the rough-hewn wood. But as she shifted her weight to get a better leverage, the altitude and the lingering fatigue from her journey caught up with her. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over her. Her hands slipped, and her knees buckled. With a gasp, she fell forward. She landed heavily on the center of the bed, her full weight driving the mattress down. The frame groaned under the sudden impact, pinning Silas's shoulders into the floorboards. A deep, muffled groan erupted from beneath her. "Sweet Lord, woman, you'll break this bed frame tonight if you ain't careful. I'm a man, not a hydraulic press." Ilara froze, her face turning a deep shade of crimson. She was sprawled across the bed, inches from where his head was tucked under the rail. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the howling wind and their synchronized breathing. Then a small, involuntary giggle escaped her lips. Silas let out a rough, huffing sound that might have been a laugh. The heavy, somber tension that had defined their time together finally snapped. In that cramped, cold cabin, they weren't just two survivors anymore. They were two people sharing a moment of clumsy, human warmth.
The laughter eventually faded, replaced by a comfortable, lingering warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. After Silas successfully hammered the oak slat back into its notch, the air in the cabin felt different, lighter, as if the storm outside had lost its power to intimidate them. Silas stood up, brushing wood dust from his heavy flannel shirt, while Ilara smoothed out the buffalo robes, her face still flushed from the shared laughter. The following morning brought a new kind of quiet. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world buried in 4 feet of pristine crystalline powder. But with the clearing skies came the deep freeze, a drop in temperature so severe that the moisture in the air turned into tiny floating ice needles known as diamond dust. "We can't be idle just because the sun is out," Silas remarked, his voice steady. "The cold is a silent thief. It'll steal the heat right out of your bones if you give it a gap to crawl through." He beckoned Ilara over to the north wall. He showed her how the extreme cold caused the logs to contract, creating tiny fissures in the chinking. This was a vital lesson in frontier architecture. Silas explained that they needed to reinforce the seals.
He produced a bucket of Pioneer's putty, a mixture of tallow, wood ash, and fine moss. "Watch the edges," he instructed softly. "If you see a frost line forming on the inside of the wood, that's where the enemy is getting in." As they worked side by side, Ilara noticed Silas's hands. They were mapped with scars and thickened by years of hard labor, yet he moved with a surprising gentleness. At one point, he reached out and took her hand, noticing the skin was raw and cracked from the dry mountain air. He didn't say a word, but he stepped away to retrieve a small tin of salve he'd rendered from pine pitch and bear fat. He knelt beside her and began to apply the balm to her knuckles. The scent of the forest filled the space between them. It was the first time they had touched with such deliberate intent. There was no roughness in him now, only a quiet, protective care. In the silence of the bitterroots, they were learning a new language. It wasn't spoken in grand declarations, but in the sealing of cracks, the sharing of medicine, and the steady rhythm of two people keeping the world at bay.
The evening fire crackled, casting a warm, amber glow that danced across the timbered walls. The smell of pine pitch and wood smoke clung to the air, creating a sanctuary against the desolate wilderness outside. Silas sat on a low stool, his silhouette a jagged mountain against the light, while Ilara sat cross-legged on the buffalo robe. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like an invitation. "You have the hands of someone who wasn't meant for a life of scrubbing floors, Ilara," Silas said quietly, his eyes fixed on the embers. "What brought a woman like you to the edge of the world?" Ilara looked down at her hands, now softened by the salve he'd given her. She took a deep breath, the cold air outside rattling the window pane. "I wasn't running to something, Silas. I was running away. My father was a merchant back east, a dreamer. He gambled on shipments that never came in. When he passed, the debt collectors didn't just take the house, they took my dignity. They wanted me to marry a man 3 times my age just to clear the ledgers." She paused, the memory of the cramped city streets feeling like a lifetime ago. "I had a distant cousin with a claim near the Columbia River. I spent my last coins on a wagon seat, thinking the West was a place where a name could be forgotten. But I realized quickly that the trail doesn't care about your past. It only cares if you're strong enough to survive it." Silas nodded slowly. He understood the desire to be forgotten. "The mountains are good for that," he whispered. "They don't ask for your papers or your lineage. They only ask for your respect." He shifted, the leather of his vest creaking. "I came here for the same reason, in a way. I had a life once, a small cabin, a garden, and a woman named Sarah. We thought we could beat the fever that swept through the valley. I spent every cent on doctors who never came. When she died, I realized that people were just another thing that could be lost. I thought if I lived where nothing grew but stone and pine, I'd never have to feel that hollow in my chest again." He looked at Ilara, and for a moment the stoic mountain man vanished. In his place was a soul just as weathered as hers. They were 2 broken pieces of the old world, discarded by the East, trying to see if they could fit together in the West. The vulnerability of the previous night lingered in the cabin like the soft glow of a dying candle. But in the Bitterroots, the mountains have a way of reminding you that survival doesn't pause for sentiment. By morning, a new sound replaced the whistling wind, the low, guttural snarl of a predator. Silas was at the window before Ilara had even rubbed the sleep from her eyes. Outside, the world was a crystalline blue, but near the heavy timber meat cache, a raised platform Silas used to keep supplies away from scavengers, 3 mountain wolves circled. They were lean, their ribs showing through thick winter coats. Hunger had made them bold. "They smell the salted venison," Silas whispered, grabbing his heavy coat.
If they get into that cache, we won't make it to the spring thaw. We'd be down to flour and hope doesn't fill a belly. He didn't reach for a rifle. Silas knew that in the deep winter, unnecessary noise could draw more trouble, and besides, he respected the balance of the woods. He grabbed a pair of heavy iron pots and a torch he had dipped in pine resin. "Stay inside," he commanded. "Keep the door barred." Alara watched through the frosted glass as Silas stepped into the knee-deep snow. He moved with purpose, banging the pots together. The sharp, metallic clang echoed through the valley, a sound so foreign to the wilderness that the wolves recoiled. He waved the flaming torch, the orange fire spitting and hissing against the cold air. It was a primal display of dominance, man using his oldest tools to protect his hearth. The wolves, sensing a fight they couldn't win without injury, began to retreat toward the tree line. But as Silas turned to ensure the cache's ladder was secure, his heel caught on a hidden shelf of black ice, a thin, invisible layer of frozen meltwater. His leg buckled with a sickening pop. Silas went down hard, his suppressed groan lost in the wind. He tried to stand, but his left ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle. He lay there, 100 yards from the cabin, as the temperature began its midday plunge. The wolves stopped at the edge of the pines, their yellow eyes turning back toward the fallen man. Silas was no longer the predator. He was the prey.
The silence that followed Silas's fall was more terrifying than the wolves' howls. Alara stood frozen behind the heavy timber door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw Silas struggle to rise, his face contorted in a mask of grit, only to collapse back into the frozen drifts. The wolves had stopped their retreat. They were intelligent creatures. They sensed the shift in the air. They saw the giant had become small. "Silas!" she screamed, her voice thinned against the vastness of the ridge. There was no time for fear. If she stayed behind that door, the mountain would claim him before the sun hit its zenith. Alara grabbed Silas's spare heavy coat and a sturdy walking staff he kept by the door. Remembering his lessons, she didn't just run out into the snow. She grabbed a bundle of dry kindling and a flask of oil. She burst through the door, not as a victim, but as a woman who had learned the high country's harshest truths. She shouted at the top of her lungs, a raw, primal sound, as she threw the oiled wood onto the embers of the torch Silas had dropped. The flames flared up, a bright, defiant orange. She moved toward him, using the staff to test the snow, her eyes never leaving the tree line. The wolves watched, confused by this new, loud creature. Alara reached Silas, who was pale and shivering. "Lean on me," she commanded. It wasn't a request. With a grunt of pain, Silas draped his massive arm over her shoulders. Alara braced her feet, feeling the incredible weight of him. She remembered what he'd taught her about the center of gravity when hauling logs. She dug in, her muscles screaming, and began to pull him toward the cabin, inch by agonizing inch. Back inside, the roles had completely reversed. Silas sat by the fire, his leg propped up, while Alara went to work. She didn't panic. She moved with a focused intensity. She boiled water, then went outside to gather fresh snow to pack around his swelling ankle, an old frontier method to keep the internal bleeding of a sprain from locking the joint. Then she picked up the heavy axe. The woodpile was low, and with Silas down, the fire was their only lifeline. She stood before the chopping block, visualizing the grain of the wood as he had shown her. She let the weight of the axe head do the work, the blade splitting the larch with a satisfying thwack. From his chair, Silas watched her through the window. He saw the city girl vanish, replaced by a woman of iron and fire. She was no longer just a guest in his cabin. She was the reason the hearth stayed warm. For the first time in years, Silas Thorne felt something he thought he'd buried forever, a profound, humbling sense of gratitude.
The weeks that followed were a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit. While Silas's ankle slowly knit itself back together, the cabin became a schoolhouse of survival. Ilara mastered the art of the slow burn fire, and Silas taught her how to read the clouds, the way the high, wispy cirrus streaks often signaled a change in the wind. But then it happened. One evening, the relentless, bone-chilling cold simply broke. A soft, warm breeze began to moan through the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. "The Chinook," Silas whispered, standing by the window without his crutch for the first time. "The Snow Eater is here." The Chinook was a legendary mountain wind, a warm breath from the Pacific that could swallow a foot of snow in a single day. To the pioneers, it was a miracle. To Silas and Ilara, it was a countdown. As the heavy drifts turned to slush and the mountain streams began to roar with the sound of rushing meltwater, the isolation that had protected them began to dissolve. The mountain pass was clearing. The atmosphere inside the cabin grew heavy, though not with the tension of before. It was a weight of unspoken words. Silas began to repair Ilara's worn leather boots, using a heavy needle and waxed sinew to reinforce the soles for the long trek ahead. He was meticulous, his hand steady, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. "The trail to the Columbia will be muddy but passable by week's end," he said, his voice as rough as the stone hearth. "You'll be able to find your cousin's claim. You'll have that life you were looking for." Ilara watched him, her heart aching in a way the cold had never managed to hurt. She thought of the city she had fled and the relatives she barely knew. Then she looked at the cabin, the bed frame they had fixed together, the hearth she had learned to feed, and the man who had shared his last bit of salt and his deepest secrets with her. She began to pack her small bundle of belongings. Every item felt heavier than it should. Silas handed her a small pouch of dried meat and a tin of the pine pitch salve. It was a survival kit, a final gift from a mountain man to a traveler. The silence between them was no longer a peace. It was a bridge that neither felt brave enough to cross. The world was opening up, but for the first time, the freedom felt like a loss.
The morning sun hit the peaks with a brilliance that was almost blinding, reflecting off the retreating snow. The world was waking up. The 100-year storm was now just a memory etched into the bark of the trees and the mud of the slopes. Silas walked Ilara to the trailhead where the narrow path dipped down toward the valley floor. He walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the day she had saved his life. At the edge of the ridge, Ilara stopped. Below them, the vast expanse of the Oregon Territory stretched out, a sea of green timber and silver rivers. It was exactly what she had traveled 1,000 miles to find: freedom. Silas stood tall, his hands tucked into his belt. "Keep to the high ground where the drainage is good," he advised, his voice thick. "And remember to watch the wind. It'll tell you what's coming before the sky does." Ilara looked at him, her eyes searching his weathered face. "Is that all, Silas? Just advice on the weather?" Silas looked away, his gaze fixed on the cabin perched on the heights. It looked small and lonely against the vastness of the Bitterroots. He realized then that the silence of the mountains, which he had once cherished as peace, now felt like a hollow ache. He thought of the laughter after the bed frame snapped, the shared broth, and the way she had stood defiantly against the wolves. "I spent years thinking I was protecting myself by being alone," Silas said, finally meeting her gaze. "But a man isn't meant to be an island, Ilara, not even a man as stubborn as me. That cabin, it isn't just a shelter anymore. It's a home, but it only stays warm when there's two people to feed the fire." He reached out, taking her hand in his. "My cousin's claim is just a piece of paper," Silas whispered, a tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "Everything I was looking for, I found it right here, on this ridge." They didn't need grand vows. In the Old West, a promise was kept in the doing. Silas took her bundle from her shoulder and turned back toward the cabin. They walked side by side,
not as a mountain man and a lost stranger, but as a family forged in the forge of winter. The bed frame might still groan, and the wolves might still howl, but as they stepped over the threshold together, the hearth fire burned brighter than ever before.
There's an old saying in the mountains, the cold only makes the heart grow warmer. We hope Silas and Ilara's journey reminded you that even in the harshest winters of our lives, redemption and love are never out of reach. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs a little warmth today. Don't forget to subscribe to Rescued by the Ridge and hit that notification bell so you never miss a tale from the frontier. But I want to hear from you. Did you think Silas would let her walk away, or did you know he'd find his voice in time? Let me know in the comments below. If you're looking for more tales of survival and romance, be sure to check out our Western Stories playlist appearing on your screen right now. Until next time, keep your fire burning bright and your spirit wild. Be well, friends.